Transform Europe is a network, a European network of political foundations and think tanks of the radical left. And we include 33 organizations from 22 European countries, European and not only countries from the European Union. We are also in parallel, apart from a network, the assigned political foundation of the Party of the European Left. And we decided in the framework of one of the main programs that we annually run, the program European Integration and the Left Strategy, to host a series of interviews with left-wing scholars, academics, politicians, hopefully activists and movements organizers, asking them their view, their perspectives upon this global pandemic, and mostly its social, political, and economic implications. We decided this to be short interviews, one-to-one. We will have different speakers and different interviewers as well. In this one, that is the first one, our main speaker is Leo Panitch. Most of you already know him. He's an Emeritus distinguished professor at the York of Political Science at the York University. He's the writer of an incredible awarded book called The Making of Global Capitalism. And he's also the editor of the Socialist Register magazine for the last like 30 years now, I think. Also, our interviewer will be Kate Hudson. Kate Hudson is an active member of our network. She comes from the UK. She's the national officer of Left Unity, which is a party, a member party of the European Left. Also, currently, she's the editor of Transform UK Journal, a quite new journal, theoretical and political in the UK. She's a historian by profession. I am now we will have half an hour, the questions posed by Kate, and then we reserve half an hour time for questions from you by the audience. And we hope to be a lot, and we hope in general this debate to be stimulating and quite fruitful. And again, I'm sorry that you cannot see Leo Panitch. He's a lovely figure. I am now giving the floor to Kate.
Thanks very much indeed, Angelina. Leo, can I just check, can you see us?
I can see you, and I must say, Kate, you're much better looking than I am. So I think the viewers are just as well off.
We'll gloss over that, so thank you. Welcome, Leo. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us today. I've been a big fan of Socialist Register. It's been a part of my political education over many years. I appreciate that, Kate. Let me say I'm honored to be the guinea pig, the first one on for this marvelous series that Transform is doing. I think that Transform has been in the forefront of the issues that we need to be discussing in the face of this crisis. Fighting austerity, fighting the new right, and pointing to the need for socialist solutions to our problems in the 21st century. So a tribute to Transform for doing this. Thank you very much. Now, I know that we've all been distressed and very angry about the scenes that we've seen on our screens over the past few weeks. We're seeing real human suffering. And I think what struck a lot of us, perhaps all of us, is how in very wealthy countries, there's such a lack of the necessary equipment to deal with the pandemic crisis. And we see that public health services, even in very wealthy countries, are really unequipped to deal with this, even though for many years now, experts and governments have been aware that pandemics are a real and coming problem. What lessons can you say that we should learn from this? What can we understand from this?
Well, the first and most obvious is that we are seeing the costs of neoliberal austerity and the terrible toll that has taken on public services and on state capacities. That said, I think there's a deeper lesson, which is that even when money was spent on public health care, on the equipment that is needed for it, it was spent, as you saw in Britain under New Labour, but more generally in the context of the marketization and the introduction of competition into the health service. And in that context, it made it much more difficult to coordinate the provision of health services, which is what we are seeing, and to coordinate the necessary equipment that is involved in this. The Center for Health and Public Alternatives in Britain has been pointing this out for years, that this is a central problem. It's not only a problem of inadequate spending, it's a problem of the introduction of competition into the health service, even when it's a public health service. In that sense, you can especially see how the reliance on private markets for supplies is most clear, of course, in the United States, but it applies more broadly. It's not well known that under the Obama administration, an order was made from a small Japanese firm to provide 40,000 ventilators to the United States at a cost of $3,000 each. That firm was bought out 2 years later by a giant conglomerate, which produced all kinds of healthcare equipment, including ventilators for $10,000 each. And they shut down after they bought out this small firm. They shut down that contract because they didn't want to undercut the price of their ventilators. So the whole contract for ventilators was only reissued again last year. So you see the tragedy of depending on private markets for this. And I'd say this is also partly the responsibility of the left, of our side. And I mean by that the failure, especially on the part of the unions, to put enough emphasis on the need for conversion. And something very close to your heart, Kate, after all, the Labour Party had a leader who was against nuclear armament, who wanted to close down Trident. And it was because of the union's protection of their members in a narrow sense, whereby they easily, the tool and die makers, could have converted to the production of medical equipment, as we now know. This was not supported, it was not taken up as Labour Party policy. But this is a much more general problem.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Now, those of you who are listening, I'm sure you'll be wanting to ask questions of Leo as we go along, but bear with us. I'm going to put my questions to Leo to start off with, and then you will have the opportunity to come back to these points later. So my next question, Leo, we're seeing that the response to the virus is very different, for example, in China, to how it is in the UK or to the United States or elsewhere. We see very different responses. The UK, of course, is infamous for Johnson's herd immunity idea, which...
Hello, I've just gotten you.
Oh,
Can you hear me now?
Fantastic.
Fantastic. I
Fantastic.
don't know why it took so long, but here you...
Oh my God. Okay, cool. I just wanted to scream.
Very, very good. So Johnson started off by talking about his herd immunity approach, and all the surveys showed that that would leave about 250,000 people dead. Now he's pulled back from that, but starting too late. So we're anticipating very high levels of death here. So this difference in approach, is it driven by the human life versus profit criterion?
Well, I don't want to speak ill of Boris at all, given the situation he's in personally right now. But even beyond that, to be fair, after all, Sweden, the great welfare, social democratic welfare state, is following that policy itself at the moment. And it's likely to be costly, as you point out. Beyond that, Boris, in his last speech to the nation before he went into hospital, after all, said very pointedly, there is such a thing as society. And what he was saying was clearly that Mrs. Thatcher was wrong. And he was admitting that what the coronavirus showed was that Mrs. Thatcher's claim there's no such thing as society was ridiculous. And you could say that this marked the end of neoliberalism as an ideology and hopefully as a state practice. You know, there was already movements in this direction. I mean, Boris stole a lot of the Labour Party's substantive anti-austerity policy, promising the hiring of nurses in the healthcare sector, et cetera, in this election campaign. Right? It wasn't only in that sense about Brexit. So hopefully this will put the nail in the coffin of neoliberalism. At the same time, I don't think we should give too much credit to China, if that's the example one is pointing to in terms of lockdowns. It took a while for them to do that themselves. But beyond that, as Ai Weiwei, who's now living in Britain, has pointed out, the great Chinese artist, you know, in terms of China's participation in world capitalism now, it's claimed to be acting in a non-neoliberal way, even in the midst of this crisis, is dubious. And you can see this because on this April 1st, China just introduced a policy, which it no doubt introduced because of pressure from the Trump administration, which allows American financial firms to take over Chinese financial firms 100%. And on April 1st, JP Morgan used $1 billion to move from being a minority stockholder in a Chinese financial firm to majority stockholder. And this reflects the extent to which the neoliberalism we're facing is a global neoliberalism, even under a Chinese authoritarian crony capitalism. In other words, what we're facing is a global problem. And you can see this most clearly in relation to now what's going to happen in the developing world, where regardless of the lockdown policy they try to introduce, the conditions there will mean that people will die of hunger if they are locked down. But secondly, they face an outflow of capital. Institutions like JP Morgan are taking money out of Argentina, out of Africa, just as they're putting $1 billion into taking over a Chinese financial firm. So, you know, it's not that anybody is doing very well in this, is the point I'm trying to make.
Okay, well, I think probably the people that we would all think are doing well in this are certainly the health service workers and all the frontline and emergency service workers. And it's now obvious that it's them, it's the workers that keep our societies from falling apart, whether it's, you know, very, very highly trained and qualified hospital doctors, whether it's nurses, supermarket employees, the people who are delivering the goods and the food to people who are not able to go out themselves. You know, that is really what is making society tick and what is helping people to survive. Some people are saying, well, the bankers can't save us from the virus, it's the workers that can save us from the virus. Do you think it's possible that from this situation, from this tragic situation, there will be a change in the class balance of forces?
Well, it's obvious that the people who are providing basic needs are, of course, the heroes of the moment. And one needs to say that extends beyond the public sector workers you've been talking about to the Amazon workers. In the internet age in which we are living, the logistics that Amazon, a powerful American transnational corporation like this, provides in terms of meeting our needs, our basic needs, is now obvious. Yet you can see that Amazon workers are in the front line doing the deliveries while not being protected in the warehouses. There's just been a strike in Staten Island in New York around this. And it points to the need for indeed taking a basic service like Amazon in the internet age into the public sector as well. What this really opens up is the extent to which all of our basic needs need to be provided through a democratic public sector. At the same time, I'd say those who think that bankers are not providing basic needs in a context of a capitalist society, which is what we live in around the world, They are indeed providing basic needs, but only, of course, in the context of a capitalist society, and it shows our dependence on them. You know, it is the Federal Reserve, the American Treasury, deploying private financial institutions that is keeping this economy going to the extent it is being kept going. And insofar as people are receiving checks now, while they are unable to receive any income, they're receiving them through the deployment of private banks and institutions. In many respects, it's the Treasury and Federal Reserve, which are the far more important institutions in keeping this irrational and unequal system of global capitalism going than it is the military. And that has been evident in the swaps that the Federal Reserve has provided dollars, through which the Federal Reserve provided dollars to the world central banks. And it now is allowing the Chinese government to get hold of dollars in the context of a repo agreement with them, a repossession agreement, whereby the Fed is taking their holdings of treasury bonds and giving them cash for it. What you see in the midst of this crisis is the extent to which in a global financial capitalism, the US state, even under the Trump administration and its gross incompetence and its gross nationalism, remains at the center of this global system. And that means that Wall Street and its satellite in London remain at the center of this global system. They too are essential, but essential in a very different way. They're essential in the context of keeping this capitalist system going amidst this crisis.
Thanks very much. Turning now to the question of Europe, I think it's also been apparent from the news coverage that the pandemic has not really brought EU solidarity to the fore, and there's been a lot of tension around that between some of the central EU states. People have noted, for example, that it's been primarily places like Cuba and China that have come to the aid of Italy, for example. Can the EU survive this crisis, do you think, or will the virus achieve what Brexit didn't?
Well, I think what it shows is that the European Union, as a capitalist project, as a capitalist construct, needs to be, the whole European project needs to be rebuilt from the bottom up with a very different purpose in mind. You could say, going back to the Treaty of Rome in 1958, that the main goal all along was to get to the point of free capital movements. And that was finally achieved with European Monetary Union in the mid-1980s, with the promise of a social charter, which was never realized, and then with the introduction of the euro, of course. And it is precisely this freeing of capital movements, the removal of capital controls from European nation states, which has allowed the bankers to impose discipline on one European state after another. And when the European Union has provided aid to those states in the context of the terrible austerity visited on, say, the Southern European states, it's provided discipline in the same way the IMF provides discipline to third world countries, with conditions of appalling austerity that involve reducing the welfare state, reducing public services in exchange for providing that type of aid against the discipline of bankers. So it's very, very hard to see that this Europe can be reconstructed. And if we look at the migration crisis and Europe's response to the migration crisis and the appalling condition of the refugee camps in Greece and the appalling physical force being used against them by European states when they try to leave Greece, right, we can see that it isn't just a matter of Brexit being driven by a fear of migrants. It isn't just a matter of people in the Midlands or in the north of England being driven by a fear of the migration crisis. All of Europe is digging its head in the sand in the face of this, or even worse. And this too, not only do we need a Europe that allows for the planning of investment, the control over capital by nation states, and support amongst each other in doing so, we need a Europe which is aware of and open to the need for resolving the migration crisis of the world, which is only going to increase through the rest of the 21st century.
So in that context, Leo, how can we make sure that nationalism, anti-migrant sentiment and the far right don't benefit politically from this crisis?
That's one of the great challenges we will face in this crisis and coming out of it. And it's by no means easy to provide solutions to that, given the way that far-right parties, building on xenophobic fears, have taken advantage of the way social democratic parties were complicit in neoliberal capitalism, and therefore lost their base of support among so many working people, and opened them up to these kinds of appeals coming from the far right. This is not the first time in history that's happened, of course. And what it points to is the absolute need for the left, and above all, the working class institutions, the unions, the mass parties, the new political parties that have formed around attempting to rebuild and reform a working class in the 21st century as a radical agency. They need to be devoting themselves to rebuilding that base. It can be done, but we need to put our shoulders to the wheel in every particular country to make sure that's the case. Now, I just heard yesterday from a friend of mine who has been stricken by the coronavirus in North London, that is her constituency Labour Party that is delivering the basic needs she needs in order to be able to stay in isolation in her apartment. I understand that Die Linke in Germany is doing the same kind of thing as food banks and soup kitchens are being closed down in this epidemic. That is an instance of the kind of work, the turning of these working class institutions once again into centers of working class life. That is fundamentally the only way that we can rebuild a working class community that is not based on xenophobia, but is based on broad diversity and tolerance and radical sentiments.
Absolutely, thank you. My final question then, before we turn to the audience participants, do you think the pandemic will change the course of economic, political and social development? And if so, in what way?
Well, one could possibly see this as a world historic event. And one could say, and some people have been pointing this out in Sweden and in Canada, that the great pandemic of 1918, the Spanish flu, seeded the post-war welfare state. That the moves towards public health emerged, what we experienced in the 20th century, started emerging in the wake of that Spanish flu. Now, I should point out that Spanish flu actually was seeded in Kansas in the United States and was taken to Europe by soldiers who, when the United States entered the First World War. We may find out that what Trump wants to call the Wuhan flu or the Wuhan virus was actually seeded somewhere else by people coming to China in the context of globalization. We'll see eventually. But the point I'm trying to make is that it could have that kind of world historic effect, but we need to remember that it took from 1918 until the end of the Second World War and the post-war period for that welfare state to be developed, for the National Health Service in Britain to be introduced, etc. And that couldn't have happened unless those working class parties and unions that I was talking about had not already previously emerged and had taken that lesson from 1918 into account in terms of the political education and mobilization they were doing. And even then, it took the Depression, the reintroduction of the gold standard, the Second World War, until the balance of class forces was shifted enough that that could be introduced. Even then, let's remember, Nye Bevan had to stuff the doctors' mouths with gold, as he put it, in order to get the National Health Service passed. And the welfare state we had was one which was always restrained and constrained and compromised by the compromise, the deal that was done with capitalism. And what we saw through the rest of the 20th century was that the private markets gained the upper hand, and the welfare state was increasingly undermined, either reduced in size or picked up the same values and practices of the private markets. We now need to relaunch that attempt to establish a meeting of basic needs through a democratic public service in the 21st century by rebuilding those working class parties, unions, and movements, with a goal to finally be able to transcend this irrational, unstable, and inadequate capitalism that we are stuck with in the face of this pandemic.
Thank you very much, Leo. That's the end of my questions. So now I'll hand over to Angelina. Angelina, there you are.
Yes,
so
hi.
Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you so much, Leo. We still do not have any questions in the Q&A box. Maybe people didn't get that they have to put their questions there. Okay, we have one. Cool. You have two now. Okay. The first one comes from Haris Golemis. You know him personally as well. And it's this: most European countries' debts will increase due to increased expenditure from their governments. Won't this lead to a new round of even bigger austerity and new memoranda? Can there be a way out of this?
Well, we'll have to see. What is different now is that every state in the world is doing this. Every state in the world, and is being aided in doing so, as I pointed out, by the American empire, by the role of the Treasury and Federal Reserve in it, is being aided in vastly increasing public debt. So it isn't as though they'll be able to discipline Greece alone. Every state in the world is doing this. Now, we'll have to see, once the crisis passes, whether there is a return to old practices. But it'll be more difficult in this context, I think, to apply that discipline. I think we are likely to see debt defaults, beginning probably in Argentina again, as the crisis worsens this year. Argentina is already officially in default for not being able to roll over its debts this month. This will happen much more broadly because even the IMF, with the $1 trillion it has available to provide short-term loans to overcome the capital that is flowing out of countries, will not be able to deal with this. And if it imposes, of course, the conditionalities, the countries won't be able to either accept those loans or be able to abide by them. So it's to be hoped that the global nature of this crisis will lead to an outcome whereby what was done to your country, Haris, will not be able to be done after this crisis. And of course, we have to mobilize within each country to make sure that's the case. What we do need to see is that those people who simply thought that Syriza capitulated, abandoned, etc., was subject to a powerful force from the outside that now needs to be overcome, because you can see the generality of the problem rather than the specificity of the Greek problem in the face of this crisis.
Sorry, thank you. The second one comes from Roberto Morea from Italy. Do you think we can come back to national welfare, since it is possible only with national taxation? and now companies are moving in tax havens, how this can be possible?
We need a new type of internationalism. During the Second World War, before Bretton Woods was introduced, it was proposed by the American Treasury, not by Keynes, that the capital controls that would remain in force after the Second World War would be cooperative capital controls. And if money continued to escape from Europe to Wall Street, even in the context of, say, the Marshall Plan, the United States would help police the capital controls that were in place in European countries as part of what the Bretton Woods Treaty would require. The actual Bretton Woods Treaty did not include that. The United States was the only country that did not introduce capital controls in 1945 and maintain them. What we need is a coordination in that respect with regard to capital movements. And that, of course, speaks to taxation. One of the main reasons, apart from neoliberal ideology, which told even working people that taxes were were against their interests, and too many working people bought that stupidly, saving what, 100 euros a year while having to experience a terribly depleted health system or education system. The main problem with taxation is, of course, that capital will threaten and will leave a particular jurisdiction to go to another one. But even capitalist countries, in the context of the contradictions of global capitalism since 2008, have been trying to arrange a coordination of tax policies. And that isn't just within the EU, but right around the world, in order to prevent exactly what you're describing. We are going to have to rely on the democratic forces within each nation state to reintroduce economic planning within each nation state of a kind, however, that is supported via international coordination amongst nation states. That type of coordination is going to have to be about limiting capital's ability to whipsaw each nation state. That has to be the basis of all of the coordination. And if this crisis shows anything, it shows the need for much more internal development, internal economic production to meet basic needs. The absurdity of trucks carrying, giant trucks, carrying mineral water from Italy, from Sicily to Norway, and other trucks passing them on the highways across Europe, carrying mineral water from Norway to Italy, because of the ecological crisis, was already absurd. You could see it was absurd. We are going to have to rely on systems of economic planning, democratic economic planning, that ensure that while international coordination continues and indeed is deepened in a progressive democratic fashion, that this facilitates the broader development of the capacities to produce what we need within those democratic frameworks that nation states provide. Now that, of course, assumes that we can democratize and can much further the nation states that we have, or to turn those that are increasingly authoritarian into democratic socialist societies.
Thank you, Leo. Okay, I take one from a woman. A big problem is that in the age of the gig economy, unions are not able to protect the new type of workers. How do you think unions could overcome this?
Well, unions need to be fundamentally changed in many, many respects in order to turn around the massive defeat that trade unionism has suffered since the 1980s everywhere. And that entails them becoming organizers again in the old sense of the word. They need to be bringing people on board who see themselves not as bargainers and administrators of collective agreements primarily, but as people who are organizing workers into collective units which will express their collective power. And unions came to rely far too much on the legal provisions that states provided them with, or the type of tripartite corporatist arrangements they created for them to sit down with the bosses in order to hold on to their memberships. That was taken away from them by reactionary legislation, or as capitalism changed and the nature of the workforce changed, not least with the fourth industrial revolution we've just gone through in telecommunications in particular, and in the service sector more broadly. Of course, the working classes that were formed into unions needed to be remade in many respects organizationally. And the unions have, because of the extent to which they were absorbed into the previous system, tried to make peace with it, relied on it for their membership and their dues, rather than became and sustained themselves as centers of working class life. Unions have largely lost the capacity to keep that going. This is a tragedy in our time, and it needs to be turned around, and there is evidence that it is being. In every country, one can point to new struggles amongst people who were previously thought to be unorganizable, of the type you're pointing to, who are engaging in struggles to organize themselves. Sometimes this is taking place amongst people who are, seen as the old middle class or the new middle class, the Beamte like teachers, or the new middle class like nurses, who have been leading the way, not least in all places of the United States, in a new unionization, and one that is very oriented to social unionism. And respect, and therefore is oriented to developing a public sector adequate to meeting the social reproduction needs of the people that nurses and teachers are servicing. But this is seen more broadly, as I indicated in the answers I was giving to Kate. Amazon workers have been trying to do this even in the middle of this crisis. In Toronto, couriers who deliver mail by bicycles, who deliver food by bicycles, have just organized a union right here in Toronto. That has entailed winning a judicial right to do so against the provision in the law that didn't allow them to do so. I think we're going to see a lot more of this coming out of this crisis, but you're right that we do very much need to engage in transforming those union organizations so they will be able to do this, and will be able to lead on the conversion of industrial enterprises into meeting the production of the basic needs that this terrible pandemic shows that we need, so that we're producing not submarines, but we're producing ventilators, just to give that example.
Thank you. There is another question that is related somehow with a question that I would like to pose to you. So it is, shouldn't we look for alternatives to traditional welfare state and rebuild it in a more democratic and effective way and keep capital out of it? And my question is, so you can answer it as a whole, that, okay, many people, even leftists, do speak now about the return of the new Keynesianism on the way that many states handle the crisis, etc., or the reestablishment of people's faith in state and national care systems, etc. But we know that this is going to be a failure. I mean, the left, the radical left, trying to reestablish a new Keynesianism would be a failure. So what do you think are the main pillars that upon them can rebuild a radical left strategy that actually will reinvent socialist politics for the 21st century. So we can move beyond Keynesianism, because actually what we did during the 2008 crisis is actually this. We tried somehow to reinvent Keynesianism, maybe with a more radical leftist discourse, but again, what are the main pillars that we can actually have for a new socialist radical left politics today?
Yes, this is one of my greatest concerns, and I appreciate those questions. The Keynesian welfare state, for even those who were most dependent on it, even for the workers who worked in nationalized industries, was not seen as their state. The institutions that they were dependent on or worked for were seen as remote, as distant. The people who ran them were not seen as accountable to the people who worked in them or to the people who depended on their services and benefits. And this is one of the reasons neoliberal ideology proved so successful, by pointing to not only the communist regimes as undemocratic, but by pointing to a bureaucratic state, which was fundamentally a capitalist state. And the reason the welfare institutions were not democratized was because they didn't want them to be examples for the private sector. You couldn't have democratized public sector institutions in a context where you had capitalist corporations which were internally as undemocratic as ever. So of course, the main struggle will have to be to revive a concern to meet people's basic needs far beyond what the Keynesian welfare state did, through the provision of public services, through taking key industries into the public sector, including finance, and making that a public utility, through the provision of free public transit, which of course would have to be paid through progressive taxation and so on. But we need to do it in a way that democratizes the institutions that do that. Now, this is no easy task. And I think it's fair to say that the movement from protest to politics that occurred after Occupy, after the anti-globalization movement, which led to Syriza getting elected, which led to the Corbyn movement in Britain, which took the leadership of the Labour Party, which led to Sanders. That I think all of those movements had this sense of the need to democratize the state in their vision to some extent. To say they had worked it out, how they would do that, is obviously not the case, and that was clearest perhaps in Syriza's case. But this wasn't only a problem of the parties. This was also a problem of the social movements, which, while they were very good at organizing protests around crucial issues in the streets, and that's always necessary, didn't take it upon themselves to put forward proposals, means, think through how the services they were calling for, how the institutions they were calling for, how the type of planning they were calling for, if you were to take, say, the ecological example, would be done in a democratic fashion, in a fashion that would be accountable even to those movements themselves. So it's all of us who need to be taking that on. I am encouraged by the development of this movement from protest to politics that gave rise to Corbyn and Sanders and Syriza. And although I think we will come to see that, as with Syriza, each of those have run it up against their limits, as is obvious now with Corbyn and is increasingly obvious with Sanders. I think what they seeded by way of the new institutions that have emerged behind them, whether it's the solidarity networks in Greece, or whether it's Momentum or the World Transformed in Britain, or whether it's the Democratic Socialists of America in the United States, or whether it's the teachers' strikes in the United States, that will continue this thrust and this emphasis in a more dynamic and creative way. And I think it will after this crisis. I think this is likely to continue. I think people may see that it's not a matter of shortcuts, that those people who thought you'd elect Syriza in 2015 and then you'd live in Valhalla were of course mistaken. Even if you elect the type of democratic socialist parties we'd like, the ability to galvanize the type of support and develop the type of strategies that would transform these undemocratic states is something that is not easy and takes a lot of development and thinking to develop the capacities to do this. So this is a long run process we're involved in. That said, I totally realize that the problems we face, and this pandemic shows it more than ever, means that we don't have a lot of time. The ecological crisis makes it clear that we don't have a lot of time. And this is the great contradiction of the left, where we stand in the 21st century. We need time in order to figure out how to build the forces that would democratize the state. We need time, and yet we don't have time. One can only hope that this world historic moment will narrow that time frame. We need to remember that it took from 1931, when the Labor government introduced austerity in the face of the Great Depression, until 1945, when a new Labor government was introduced, which introduced the welfare state. It took 14 years. It's my hope that in the face of this crisis, this period will be telescoped. Now, it would have been better if Jeremy Corbyn and the people around him had been, especially the young people he mobilized, had been left today in charge of the Labour Party. But they remain as forces in the Labour Party, and the people who produce Sanders will remain as forces in American politics, whether inside or outside the Democratic Party. I think increasingly outside, but we'll see. And in other words, the struggle continues.
Thank you, Leo. We are officially out of time, but I will take two more questions. You can be short. The first one actually touches a very important aspect. Can you comment on some of the developments in Central Europe, especially Hungary, which is using the state of emergency to concentrate power? How do we organize in this context?
Very difficult, and of course, very ugly, and to be expected, not only in Hungary, I fear. I think one of the things that we need to say about this is that the Cold War ideology, that it was only the left that produced authoritarianism, and it was capitalism that gave us liberal democracy, is proven by the Eastern European case. It's not only Hungary, although Hungary is the most visible example. It's obviously Poland and it's the Ukraine. That authoritarianism in the post-communist era is increasingly visible in those states. And you see it, of course, in Russia itself. This gives the left, I think, the basis for saying, no, it's not communism that yielded authoritarianism in Eastern Europe. On the contrary, it was communism's embedding itself in all kinds of xenophobic and nationalist sentiments, which Stalinism to some extent represented, we need to recognize. That was the real problem, was the use of the state without the democratization of the state that was the real problem. So, you know, I think that gives us an ideological leg up. I also think that the fear that these type of right-wing forces will be able to sustain themselves by an ideology of xenophobic nationalism is to some extent limited by the extent to which they're capitalist classes, even when they are bankrupt mafias, as many of them are. will be interested in pulling out of the global capitalism that they have become so part of, each of the local bourgeoisies. So fascism was very much about, from a right-wing perspective, using capital controls and tariffs, etc., in order to break with an international capitalist bourgeoisie. These right-wing forces will not be able, I think, to sustain the support, even from local bourgeoisies, to do this. And in that context, won't be able to fulfill the threats they make against the EU or against free trade, etc. There too, I think, their promises will increasingly be seen to be hollow in the eyes of people who do understand that a globalized neoliberal capitalism is not in their interest, but have been induced, partly because of the failures of communism and social democracy, to go back to a xenophobic nationalism as the solution. I don't know whether that's much of an answer. I think this remains a great danger in the short run. And it's all the more reason why we need to be making the case, including to liberals, for a democratic socialism. We need to make them understand that their deep anti-socialist antipathies need to be overcome, even if they want to hold on to the elements of liberal democracy that need to be so cherished. We need to get beyond capitalism in order to hold on to democratic freedoms. Rosa Luxemburg is being proven right. What she said at the beginning of the 20th century is being proven in spades at the beginning of the 21st century. The choice is between socialism or barbarism.
Thank you, Leo. Now, this is the last question I can take, and I'm sorry because I think I leave 3 others already posed, but we don't have much time. And I want you also to give you 1 or 2 minutes to conclude whatever you want to say. So the last question is, we have seen that in the last 40 years, neoliberalism has been the dominant ideology in economics, state practice, and even in social behavior. During this time, the global growth has declined from 4% in the golden era to 3%. The wage labor has risen, the real salaries are stagnated, and the working class is fragmented in many, many levels, along with the decline in trade union membership. The financial crisis found the left with no alternative to neoliberalism. Do you think during the coming nationalizations, should the left have an alternative on what to do with these businesses? Is now a time to push for democratization in businesses and in states, given the lack of the capitalists to provide real solutions?
Well, that's less of a question than it's a statement of what needs to be done, with which I entirely agree. I do think we need to recognize that neoliberalism as an ideology was never as popular as it made itself out to be. We can't forget that it was already at the end of the 90s that the anti-globalization movement formed, that you had the mass demonstrations starting in Seattle and Quebec City and Genoa against neoliberal global capitalism. And I think it's been clear, at least since the 2008-2009 crisis, that neoliberalism as an ideology had lost its legitimacy. That said, neoliberal practices were reproduced with a vengeance, in fact. I think that this pandemic will nail neoliberal ideology for good and all. And I think Boris Johnson, from the leadership of the Conservative Party, saying against Mrs. Thatcher there is such a thing as society, proves that. That said, of course, interests like that will have no interest in democratizing the state and democratizing the corporations, the economy, in the way the questioner is putting. And that's why it is so incumbent on socialists to be able to convince those people who have been disabused of neoliberalism but remain suspicious of socialism or disillusioned with it, that there is a possibility as well as a necessity for a democratic state and a democratic economy and democratic economic planning in the 21st century, that we cannot possibly solve the problems we face, the threat of authoritarianism, the terrible ecological crisis, the increasingly crisis-ridden and irrational nature of capitalist economies, without democratic socialist solutions. We have to win people over to that perspective. It's not a hard argument to make, precisely given the way in which neoliberal ideology has exposed the contradictions of capitalism as the questioner was putting them.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I don't know if Kate would like to make a comment, and last comment, or also Barbara Steiner, who was the silent moderator and she's the director of Transform. Kate, would you like to say a few words? Something?
Just one quick point, really, particularly to thank Leo for what he said. I'm very, very glad that you've been recording this, Angelina, and that it will be available on the Transform Europe website. One of the things I hear people saying more and more now in this context, in the crisis, in the lockdown, is there can be no going back. You know, people don't like what they're going through, but as we're seeing homeless people being housed from the streets, as we're seeing arms companies making ventilators, people are saying we don't want normal after the pandemic to be how it was before. We want a new norm. We want a new type of society where there is more justice and equality and our needs are properly funded. And many people are talking about even more radical changes than that. And I'm sure, I hope that these seminars, these webinars, all the discussion we're having will be part of envisioning a new type of society and making the radical left part of fighting for that, getting organized to make a new type of society. So together, united, we can really bring about a change in society.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you all. Thank you, Leo, for accepting our invitation to be here. Thank you, Kate, so much. Thank you all for attending this web seminar. We are sorry for all the technical problems we had in the very beginning. We are still learning how to do these things and accommodate to the new situation. We want to make an announcement that 2 days from now, on Thursday, the same time, we will have another interview such as this one with Luciana Castellina, and Haris Rolemis will interview her. We will have the announcement in our website and also in our Facebook page, and you will all be informed, especially because you will receive a follow-up email since you have registered here. Thank you so much. Thank you again. Have a nice evening and take care. Be strong. Have faith. Organize. Don't agonize. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.